stopped.
Nice, here we go.
Ocean Invaders on Nova.
Wednesday night at 8 on KTWU.
This is KTWU, local public television.
Good evening and welcome to the KTWU studios on the campus of Washburn University. I'm Val Vandersloot, General Manager for KTWU.
And I'm Amber Dickinson, Professor of Political Science for Washburn University.
KTWU and the Washburn University Political Science Department are proud to bring this evening's debate forum to you. As the public television station in Northeast Kansas, it is important for us to provide you with knowledge and insight as you exercise your rights as an informed voter.
The Washburn University Political Science Department has a long tradition of providing real-world experience in the study of governments, public policies, and political behavior using both humanistic and scientific perspectives and skills to examine the countries and regions of the world. We take great pride in providing a neutral ground for open discussions on politics and policies and conducting public issue forums like this one.
Now, please stay tuned as we bring you the candidates vying for a seat in the race for Kansas Attorney General in Kansas.
KTWU Public Television and the Washburn University Department of Political Science present a political forum featuring candidates for the office of Kansas Attorney General. Here's your moderator, Nick Haynes.
It is one of the most watched Attorney General races in the country. This hour we bring you Republican Kris Kobach and Democrat Chris Mann in the Kansas Attorney General debate. Hello, I am Nick Haynes, news host at KTWU's sister station in Kansas City. Has there ever been a time when our state attorney generals have been more in the news? Have you noticed that they're now in the middle of pretty much every hot button issue dividing America, from abortion to gun rights, from whether your kids will wear masks at schools, to offering legal opinions on whether transgender athletes should be allowed to compete in girls' sports. In the next 60 minutes, we give you a chance to see both candidates up close as they answer questions from you on Facebook and Twitter, from our studio audience and from our debate partners, the students and faculty at the Washburn University Political Science Department. But first, let me introduce you to the candidates. Kris Kobach was twice elected Kansas Secretary of State and is a former constitutional law professor at UMKC. His opponent is Democrat Chris Mann, a former police officer and prosecutor who now runs his own private practice law firm in Lawrence. One of the things I have to say about this particular race, when we think about this, this is like a candidate interview in a sense. When we hire people for a job, we're hiring you to be our top lawyer, to be representing us for the entire state of Kansas. That's a big job. What makes you more qualified than the other guy we're interviewing today? And this is going to start, you're going to start for us, Chris Mann.
Well, thanks for having me here, Nick. My name is Chris Mann, and I am a lifelong Kansan, a former police officer and prosecutor running for Kansas Attorney General. I've spent my entire life dedicated to locking up violent criminals, protecting Kansans from fraud, and advocating for victims. I started my career in public service as the youngest police officer in Lawrence, Kansas. When I was injured in the line of duty, I kept that dedication to public safety, but transitioned to the courtroom instead, prosecuting violent criminals in Wyandotte County. Then I went to the state, where I prosecuted white-collar criminals, preying on the elderly. Most recently, I've worked with Mothers Against Drunk Driving and in my own law firm to advocate for victims of drunk driving in the courtroom and in our legislature, where I've helped to pass laws to keep roads safe. As Attorney General, I plan to continue my career in public service by focusing on public safety and not politics. When I'm elected, I'll protect Kansans from violent crime, which has skyrocketed in the past decade. I'll fight consumer fraud, which has harmed seniors and other vulnerable Kansans. And I'll defend our constitutional rights. Kansans are tired of career politicians using this office to grandstand and chase the spotlight. They want someone who will just do the job. To me, the Attorney General's job is simply to serve the people of Kansas. As a former police officer and prosecutor, my priority will always be keeping Kansas families safe.
Thank you, Chris Mann. Kris Kobach.
Well, thank you, Nick. Many voters know that I was Kansas Secretary of State for 8 years and brought photo ID to elections in Kansas. But they may not know my legal background. After graduating from Harvard College and Yale Law School, I clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, and then was a law professor for 15 years at UMKC, where I taught constitutional law. I also served 2 years at the U.S. Department of Justice as counsel to Attorney General John Ashcroft. In addition, for the past 20 years, I've been a civil litigator who's argued more than a dozen federal lawsuits defending cities and states across the country against the ACLU. I've been the lead attorney arguing cases in the 3rd, 5th, 6th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and D.C. circuits. And that is an attorney general's #1 job, defending laws in court. And I've been doing it for 2 decades in private practice. In addition, a state attorney general is the one official who can stop a president of either party when he violates the Constitution. More than any other attorney in Kansas, I have done that, litigating a total of 4 such lawsuits. I've defeated both the Obama administration and the Biden administration in federal court. I defeated the Obama administration when I represented 10 ICE agents challenging the illegal DACA amnesty. And I defeated the Biden administration representing North Dakota companies and employees challenging the OSHA vaccine mandate. I have 2 cases now pending against the Biden administration. Most importantly, I'm representing airmen at McConnell Air Force Base, suing to protect their First Amendment right to religious freedom and an exemption to the vaccine mandate. It is unconscionable that the men and women in uniform who risk their lives to protect our constitutional rights are having their own constitutional rights taken away from them. Very few attorneys have the skill set to fight and win these complex lawsuits against the U.S. Department of Justice. That's why 35 sheriffs have endorsed me. They know that I have what it takes to keep Kansas safe and to keep our constitutional freedoms secure.
Well, now we've gotten to know you a little better. Let's talk about some of the issues themselves. It's been quite some time now since fear of crime has been one of the biggest concerns for Kansans. Nationwide, it's becoming a rising issue on voters' minds during the midterm election. Starting with you, Kris Kobach, what is the single most important action you can take as Attorney General to reduce crime?
I actually proposed a 3-point plan. Point number 1, I will say, is the most important, and that is, I said first, I would propose that the Kansas legislature adopt an amendment to Kansas laws governing trafficking in drugs. It would be a death-caused enhancement. So in the case of fentanyl, which is a drug that the dealers presumably do not intend to cause the death of their consumers, it is happening all the time. And indeed, there have been now more than 500 Kansans who have died of fentanyl overdoses. It's a 561% increase in 2021 numbers from what it was in 2015. So it's rising. So that would be my first reform, would be getting that one done in the legislature with respect to crime. Secondly, I would lead an interstate effort with our sheriffs, cooperating with sheriffs in border states, specifically Texas, where I have a good relationship with many sheriffs there, so that they can share information to stop the cartels from bringing the fentanyl in to the United States. And then thirdly, I have proposed that we need a statewide task force to deal with this retail organized crime, which I think many Kansans haven't heard about. You may have heard of what are called push-outs, where people go to a Lowe's or a Home Depot and they load a cart with expensive tools and then push right out the door because they're no longer being stopped by store personnel. It's become a multi-million-dollar racket, and it needs statewide effort to coordinate it. So those are my 3 points.
That's Kris Kobach's solution to crime. What is your biggest thing you would do to reduce crime, Kris Mann, if you're elected Attorney General?
Well, thanks, Nick. And I have to point out that I'm the only person on this stage that has ever actually handled criminal cases as a police officer and as a prosecutor. I've chased down violent criminals and arrested them. I've prosecuted violent criminals. And I know what it takes to get the job done and to make a community safe. And I can tell you that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. As I've traveled the state of Kansas and talked to communities from east to west, I've learned that there are significant issues, including domestic violence. It has increased dramatically since the start of the pandemic, and domestic violence shelters are overwhelmed. They're underfunded. They're often turning away victims. And that's not just of domestic violence, but of human trafficking as well. We need to make sure that we are supporting victims in the state and that we're doing the job of the Attorney General, which is filling gaps in prosecutions, filling gaps in investigations, making sure that law enforcement across the state that relies on the Attorney General's office to help them are supported. and we're able to work community by community to drive down the violent crime problem. That's what it's going to take, a community by community effort to do that. My opponent has talked about changing some drug laws. Well, we already have a drug enhancement law on the books. It's KSA 21-5430. It says if you deliver drugs...
That's as much time as you have on that. I know you'll find a way to weave it in later, Mr. Mann, but in a debate in Wichita, you both declared that the federal government has failed to do enough about immigration. But what role should the Kansas Attorney General play in what is largely a national issue?
And I said just that. It is, in fact, largely a national issue. Our federal government needs to step up and do what they're supposed to do. What we need to do here in Kansas, what we can do, is I've talked to organizations like the agriculture community and our service worker industry. We need to find ways to help undocumented workers get visas that will allow them to participate in society. Not only does that help our business community, but it also will help our crime problem, because as undocumented immigrants are able to participate more in society, they're more willing to be witnesses to crime. They're more willing to come forward as the victim of crime. And that means we're able to root out the violent criminals in communities, hold them accountable, and make our communities safer. My opponent has spent decades pushing unconstitutional anti-immigration laws across this country that have cost communities millions of dollars attempting to enforce. And that's what we can expect that he'll do again here in Kansas. I will focus on helping the people of Kansas, not other states and across the country. We need to work right here to keep our communities safe.
And you have a chance to respond, Mr. Kobach.
Well, let me begin where my opponent just left off. We have to recognize that you need the right experience when you're taking this job. I have been recruited by cities and states across the country to defend their immigration laws because they sought a national expert on it. My opponent has never argued a single case in federal court. You need someone with experience to take the job of Attorney General. As far as immigration goes, yes, I have written laws for Arizona, Alabama, Missouri, a host of cities. And this is a real issue that cities and states are facing because every state is a border state now. And our fentanyl problem, which I was just talking about, is an immigration problem. Every ounce of fentanyl comes across that southern border and is brought here by the cartels. To ignore immigration when you look at fentanyl is absolutely insane. And by the way, just last week, you may have heard in Wichita, there was a raid in which over 500,000 and up to 1 million pills were recovered. That raid wasn't just the largest in Kansas. It is the largest ever in the entire United States. So the fentanyl problem is very real. We have to look at this problem of immigration and recognize it affects the safety of our communities in Kansas. I am willing to use state laws, like many other states have, including Kansas in the past, to address illegal immigration. Like, for example, our law on identity theft in Kansas versus Garcia, the United States Supreme Court said that can be used to deter and discourage illegal immigration. I will continue to fight that fight.
Kris Kobach, you have talked in this campaign of eliminating ballot drop boxes if you were elected Attorney General. Kansas currently has an elected statewide officer in charge of elections. He's called Secretary of State. So what role, if any, should the Attorney General play in questions of how Kansans vote?
Oh, that's a great question, Nick. The 2015 statute passed by the Kansas legislature gives the job of prosecuting election crimes to the Attorney General, the Secretary of State, and to the relevant county. What we have learned historically in Kansas is that the counties rarely have the expertise or the resources to prosecute. So then you have to look to statewide officials. The Secretary of State may or may not have adequate attorneys to do the job. Our current Secretary of State has suggested that he doesn't. So the Attorney General is actually now the chief law enforcement officer for prosecuting election fraud. And if you want to deter it, you have to prosecute it. Now, with respect to ballot drop boxes, I take a law enforcement approach. Kansas has a law that says you can't ballot harvest. What's ballot harvesting? That's delivering 10 or more ballots that are not your own. But if we have drop boxes all over the state, anybody can walk up to a drop box and dump in 100 ballots. That's the problem. They undermine our current criminal law against ballot harvesting. And so that way, if you get rid of them, you force individuals to still, they can deliver other people's ballots, but they deliver them to a human being. And the nice clerk behind the desk can say, oh, weren't you here yesterday delivering 10 ballots? You have a witness to the crime. Right now, our current crime of ballot harvesting is unenforceable because of the drop boxes. You need to think about how law enforcement can best be accomplished, and right now the drop boxes are hindering the enforcement of election fraud.
You got a chance to respond, Kris Mann.
Thank you. Well, I have to say that ballot drop boxes have been said to be safe and effective ways to return ballots, and that was said by our Republican Secretary of State, Scott Schwab. Our elections here are some of the safest and most fair in the entire country. We do an excellent job of making sure of that. There are checks and balances that occur after those ballots are dropped off. And it is the Attorney General's job to prosecute if there is election fraud, and I would do that if that case is found. But even Derek Schmidt has not found a case of election fraud to prosecute. So either Kris Kobach is saying Derek Schmidt is falling down his job, or the cases just don't exist at the level that Kobach thinks they do. In fact, he has spent his career chasing 3 million illegal voters that he's never found. And he's cost our state millions of dollars pursuing unconstitutional laws. This simply isn't what people want.
And your time is up. You know, we're told from national polls that rising prices is the #1 concern on America's minds this election year, with a large consumer protection division in the AG's office. What would you do to make sure Kansas residents are not being taken advantage of at the gas pump, the grocery store, and from in-person and online service providers, Mr. Mann?
This is one of the keys to my campaign, is consumer fraud. This often affects the elderly and our most vulnerable populations, and we need to do everything we can to fully staff that unit, make sure that we're upgrading technology to take on more sophisticated scam artists. That's what the work of the Attorney General's office should be. And I'm the only one on this stage that's ever prosecuted financial fraud. I'm the only one here that has ever sat in the living room of an elderly couple who lost their life savings to a scam artist and then walked into the courtroom and held that scam artist accountable. That's the kind of experience that we need with someone who is going to be in charge of the Consumer Fraud Division. The only experience my opponent has is being the attorney for and a board member of an organization that is currently under indictment for fraud. And if he sat by and watched his own organization commit fraud, how do we expect him to help the people of Kansas?
You have a chance to respond, Kris Kobach.
Yeah, there's a lot to respond to there. Well, in his prior statement, he indicated that there must not be an election fraud in Kansas. Well, when I was Secretary of State over the course of a 2.5-year period, we prosecuted 12 cases of election fraud to a guilty plea. It does exist, indeed. And as far as other fraud cases, other crime cases I prosecuted, when I was at the U.S. Department of Justice, I did the harder job of criminal prosecution, which is defending the guilty verdict on appeal. And I went to the Ninth Circuit on behalf of the United States and won 2 cases, again, you heard right, in the Ninth Circuit, defending immigration crimes. And when Arizona needed someone to uphold their human smuggling statute, criminal conviction on appeal, they turned to me. So I have multiple cases of convictions, both in fraud and in other areas, and in doing the harder part of the job, which is defending the law on appeal. That requires a greater degree of acumen and familiarity with the law and ability to do appellate litigation, and I have that. Back to the original point, fraud. Yeah, consumer fraud is a huge problem in Kansas, and I have said, I'm the only candidate on stage who's actually put a detailed plan on our website. I've said we have to beef up our consumer fraud unit. The scammers are using more and more sophisticated methods to go after particularly the elderly. You know, 20 years ago, it was a phone call that tried to get you to give your credit card number. Now it's fake texts, fake websites that look exactly like the real company's website. We have to beef up this unit, and I will keep our protection strong.
Thank you. If you're elected Attorney General, Kris Kobach, would you use the power of your office to advocate for changes to the state's current abortion law or to the regulations that govern abortion clinics?
Right now, we have, the short answer to the question is the biggest job on that is going to be protecting our existing laws on the books. Kansas has approximately a dozen pro-life laws on the books that are intended to ensure that abortion is as infrequent as possible and it is safe when it occurs, and that is truly the result of consent, informed consent. And so my chief job will be in defending the existing laws. Now that will be more difficult in the wake of the August 2nd vote on the Value Them Both Amendment, but it is not impossible at all. There are precedents that allow us to defend those laws, and I want to know if my opponent will vigorously defend those laws. He has indicated that he probably won't even defend them. He said, and I think I can quote him directly, he said when he was asked by a reporter about the existing laws on the books, he said, "I won't waste the limited resources of the Attorney General's office attacking the reproductive rights of women." Now remember end quote. Remember the question was, are you going to be defending those laws? Well, I will defend those laws, and I think people want us to. These laws are reasonable, and the vast majority of Kansans agree with them. For example, the law requires parental consent for a minor to get an abortion. The law prohibits very late-term abortions after the baby is already viable. And the law prevents the public funding of abortion. I will defend every law on the books in Kansas, whether I agree with it or not, and I will defend it vigorously. That is what we must do in this area.
Kris Mann.
Thank you. Well, the people in the state of Kansas clearly spoke on August 2nd. They want there to be a constitutional right to make private medical decisions, and that's what they said in that rule. They didn't want to change the Constitution. The job of the Attorney General is, in fact, to defend state laws that are challenged. But what my opponent misses is that there's a threshold matter. And Derek Schmidt has written an Attorney General opinion on this, saying that the threshold matter is you must first make sure that that law is constitutional. And if it is found constitutional, then you shall defend that law. That's the key. My opponent has said he will blindly defend any law that our legislature passes, and that's simply not how this job works. That's a political ideology, and it's not the way that the job works. Now, my opponent, you asked about attacking laws. My opponent has said at the Pachyderm Club just a couple weeks ago that he will slowly and quietly work to change the laws of how judges are selected so he can pack the court with ultra-conservative justices that will overrule the will of the people. That's what he said, and we can bet that he'll try and do that.
You're talking about, in that question, the enforcing of laws, what things you will enforce. I have the ability in the rules to ask a follow-up question I am going to, and it's going to start with you, Kris Kobach. You know, state attorney generals around the country are gaining points for actually refusing to enforce state laws. They don't agree with their political positions. If you're a Democrat, and some Democratic AGs have refused to defend laws in their states against that are outlawing abortion. Republican AGs, for instance, have refused to defend state laws that restrict gun ownership. Is there any state law, Mr. Kobach, you would refuse to prosecute or enforce?
Not that I'm aware of at this time, unless someone can find me one, but I want to address what my opponent just said. He said that you can make a threshold determination as Attorney General. You can decide in your mind if a law is unconstitutional or not. Well, if my opponent decides that apparently all of our reasonable pro-life laws are unconstitutional, he's not going to defend them. Ladies and gentlemen, that undermines our representative system entirely, because the people of Kansas have passed those laws. You don't give the Attorney General a veto and he'll decide which laws he's going to defend or not. That sends a bright signal to the ACLU. Come on in, sue, challenge the constitutionality of any one of those laws, our parental consent law, for example, and I, Kris Mann, won't defend it because I agree with you that it's unconstitutional. That is not what the Attorney General's office is empowered to do. That changes the Attorney General's office into a king who can unilaterally erase the laws. And no, I will not give you a list of laws that I won't defend.
Is there any state law that you would refuse to prosecute or enforce? You could have a Republican governor, and they would change abortion laws in Kansas. Would you still enforce those?
Look, my role as Attorney General, I do not see as a political role. It's a continuation of my work in public service, and the job of the Attorney General is to enforce the laws on the books, to defend the laws that are passed by our legislature. But unless my opponent thinks that Derek Schmidt doesn't know what he's talking about, he has said that there has to be a threshold issue of making sure that that law is constitutional before the Attorney General shall defend it. My job is to do the work in the office. I don't have a political agenda like my opponent. I want to come in there and do my very best to continue helping the people of Kansas.
Outgoing Kansas Attorney General Derek Schmidt joins several other states in filing a legal challenge against the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness program. The program, of course, is now on hold, but if you were Attorney General, would you have joined the lawsuit, or do you think the State Attorney General's office shouldn't get involved in student debt, Kris Mann?
Yeah, so my opinion on all of these federal lawsuits is we need to look at whether or not it's going to help the people of Kansas more than it's going to hurt the people of Kansas. These lawsuits are going to continue whether or not the state of Kansas decides to pile on to the lawsuit. And we have limited resources in the Attorney General's office. Unlike my opponent, I don't want to start a new unit to sue the federal government, to waste our resources doing that, because we have important work to do right here in Kansas. I will be focused on helping the people of Kansas with everyday issues, whether that's consumer fraud, Medicaid fraud and abuse, making sure that I'm working community by community to drive down violent crime and support victims. It's a work I've done my entire life and the work that I will continue to do. My opponent has said he'll wake up every morning and for breakfast find a new way to sue the federal government. And that's simply a waste of our resources when we need to be focusing on important issues right here in Kansas.
Kris Kobach, your chance to respond.
Well, he didn't give a direct answer, did he? He did say, though, that he thought it might waste our resources, and he said he'd first ask, will it help or hurt the people of Kansas? Well, that's not an answer to the question. Look, this is a cut and dried issue, and it appears he would not join the lawsuit that a handful of states have brought. It is unconstitutional for the U.S. president by executive decree to spend $500 billion. That's $500 billion for giving student loans. Our Constitution lays out very clearly that only the legislative branch has the authority to spend money and tax the citizenry. The Biden administration is clearly acting unconstitutionally in this matter. So there's that duty first. The Attorney General has the authority and the obligation to defend our Constitution. But also, the Biden policy is horribly unfair. Think about it. You may have decided to not attend the most expensive college and choose a cheaper one, or maybe you didn't go to college, or maybe you worked your way through college, and you now are going to be saddled with paying the bills to pay off the loans of somebody else who decided to go to the most expensive college and not quite sure how he was going to pay for it. It is horribly unfair, especially when you talk about people who didn't go to college at all because they couldn't afford it. This is unfair not only in the eyes of Republicans, but the majority of Democrats agree as well. So it is unconstitutional and it is unfair. And of course, if I'm Attorney General of Kansas, we will try to stop it. We must protect our Constitution.
We're getting questions from our audience, from Facebook and Twitter, and from, of course, the faculty and students of Washburn University's Political Science Department that are co-sponsors. A lot of questions are about marijuana. Just across the state line, Missouri voters will decide in November to legalize recreational marijuana. If it's approved, what legal advice would you be giving Kansas-side police departments, district attorneys and prosecutors on how they should handle cases of Kansans getting their fix in Missouri, or Missourians smoking weed in the parking lots of Kansas-side shopping malls or other gathering places? That starts with you, Kris Kobach.
Well, I would tell them that it's going to be very difficult, and it's for that reason that I have opposed the legalization broadly of marijuana use in Kansas. The Department of Justice just did a study released in 2020 about marijuana use in the state of Washington, which was one of the first states to legalize it since 2014. And they had several conclusions. One is it resulted in a marked increase in the number of teenagers and children using marijuana. It wasn't, even though it was legalized just for adults, it spread among minors as well. Secondly, it resulted in a significant increase in driving while impaired by consuming marijuana, leading to traffic fatalities and other accidents. And police officers have been particularly unhappy with it in those states because unlike alcohol, where there is a BAC objective standard of 0.08%, with marijuana there is no clear line. And the officers don't have the tools to obtain evidence that establishes a clear prosecution, and the prosecutors are unable to say clearly that the person was impaired or not impaired, given that you don't have those objective standards. So there are so many problems that happen when a state legalizes marijuana. I would say, first of all, should not do so. But if we go, even taking the first step toward medical marijuana, which I don't think we should do at this time, you have to proceed very cautiously and recognize that every state that has legalized medical marijuana has seen it explode in recreational uses as well.
Kris Mann.
Look, this is a simple answer. Right now, the Attorney General's job is to enforce the laws that are on the books, and we shouldn't be giving advice to the contrary. If our legislature decides to change those laws, then changes come with that. But that's the legislator's prerogative. If they decide to do so, I would support medical marijuana legalization with safeguards, making sure we're protecting children, making sure we're providing more drug treatment, because that's going to help our crime problem overall, and making sure that we're providing money to law enforcement. I've worked this issue as a police officer, as a prosecutor, and I've worked it when I was with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. We dealt with this issue in the rollout of legalization, and we recognized that there need to be additional training, there needs to be additional scientific studies done so that we can best determine what the level of impairment is for driving under the influence and make sure we're keeping our roads safe. So those are the issues that we need to tackle if our legislature decides to do that.
We're getting lots of questions, as I say, from Facebook and Twitter and from our audience here. Here's one. How will you approach civil rights movements stemming from disproportionate arrests or police, as I put my teeth back in, police brutality against minorities? And that goes to you first, Kris Mann.
Yeah, and again, I've been a police officer and a prosecutor, and I have witnessed times when folks were uncomfortable with what the police have done, and I found that communication and transparency are paramount to solving those problems. When I was a police officer, that's what we did. We communicated with our community to make sure that they understood why things were happening the way they were, and we were transparent about how the laws were enforced and what was going to happen. We need to bring together law enforcement and community leaders to make sure we're building trust in the event that there is an issue that happens in the future, so that trust is already there and they can work together to quell any unrest and keep people who are breaking the law from doing so.
What would be your approach, Kris Kobach?
Well, my approach is we don't need to defund the police. We need to defend the police. Especially in 2021 and in 2020, there were so many unwarranted attacks. Of course, there were a few cases where there was truly a police officer who broke the law, but there were so many unwarranted attacks against the police institution in general, against law enforcement. And that's why I'm endorsed by 35 sheriffs in this race. My opponent is only endorsed by one former sheriff. No sheriff who is accountable to the people right now has endorsed him. They know that I will stand up for law enforcement. Now, a perfect example of this difference between us regarding law enforcement is the death penalty. My opponent said in a previous debate in Wichita that he's opposed to the death penalty. Well, look, in Kansas, we use the death penalty to deter cop killers. If you kill a police officer, that murder is death penalty eligible under our laws. But under Kris Mann, you would have either an unwilling or a reluctant attorney general to impose that penalty. And Kansas cop killers, like Scott Cheever, who is currently on death row, would not face the death penalty. In Kansas, the Attorney General plays a critical role in ensuring that our men and women in blue are protected against people who would kill them, and one of the ways of doing that is by deterring it with the death penalty. In contrast, my opponent's party, and of course he donated to Joe Biden, has had this soft on crime agenda, this so-called criminal justice reform that has led to a massive surge in murders. Kansas is 23% above the 10-year average. There are 173 murders in our state last year. It is a problem.
Thank you very much. Would you support Kris Kobach changing the way Kansas selects its judges?
Yes, absolutely I would. Our current system, I assume you're talking about the Supreme Court.
It could be any.
Okay. Well, the one that is currently being discussed is the Supreme Court system. Right now we have something called the Missouri Plan, adopted in the 1950s, and that should have been our first clue that it was a bad idea, that it's called the Missouri Plan. It is the only one in the country where the body of attorneys controls the majority of a selection panel, then selects the justices, and gives them to the choice of 3 to the governor. There is no accountability in the system whatsoever. And as a result, I would say Kansas does not have the finest Supreme Court in the country. Indeed, the Kansas Supreme Court has been overturned more than any other state's Supreme Court by the United States Supreme Court in recent years. We do need a change. I believe we should either go to the federal model, which is where the executive appoints and the legislature confirms, which I believe 14 states have, or we should go to popular election, which 22 states have. Remember, Kansas is an oddball. We are the only state in the country with this extreme version of the Missouri model. It's time for accountability. You know, the Missouri model was defended as a way of bringing nonpartisanship into judicial selection, but all it did was take partisanship behind closed doors, so that people have no idea why the choices are being made, who they're considering. Instead, we need to bring it out into the open. We with either the federal model or with popular election.
Mr. Mann.
Thank you. So I think we have a great model here, and despite what my opponent said, there are actually 21 states that use a merit selection process to select their justices. And that is because it's a process that keeps it nonpartisan. It is a bipartisan group that gets together to select three people to go to the governor, who are then selected as the next justice. That does the best job of keeping it from being a partisan political office. And it was changed in the 1950s because that direct selection by the governor was found to be fraudulent. That's why it was changed. That's why we had to make it a nonpartisan election. So the problem with my opponent's plan is he tells you it's a better model. But what he's not telling you, and what he told the Pachyderm Club, was that he actually wants to change this so he can, in his words, slowly and quietly get rid of the judges we have, pack it with judges that agree with his political ideology, and overrule the will of the people and take away women's constitutional rights. Now, that's just not what the people of Kansas want. And I can tell you that, once again, my opponent's a career politician, so we're used to them lying, but I have to say he did it again. I've never said I would not use the death penalty. I said, although I don't agree with it, my job is to enforce the law.
While the cost of living, we're told, is the biggest issue on voters' minds, some political analysts claim that for many voters, education is the iceberg issue of the midterm election. What role, if any, Mr. Mann, should the Kansas Attorney General play in deciding what's taught in the classroom or which books should be kept on school library shelves?
Well, I have a family full of teachers, from my mother-in-law to my sister. My mom was in education, and I can tell you that our teachers have a very difficult job that I appreciate. I'm the product of public schools, so are my kids, and I think that our schools are in the best position to determine what is used as far as materials in school and how they will be used. Look, I'm not trained in education. Our school teachers are there for a very specific reason, and I want to make sure they have the ability to do just that. I don't think it's the Attorney General's job to interfere with how local school boards decide to run their schools. That's up to them, and that's where I'll leave it.
Kris Kobach.
Well, let me begin with what he just said. He strangely said that Kris Kobach wants to slowly, silently pack the Supreme Court with judges. Well, let me begin with a very simple constitutional lesson. In the Kansas Constitution, in fact, in none of the 50 state constitutions does the Attorney General have the power to appoint judges to the Supreme Court. I simply have said that when you have a system, a change in the system, you will over time have change in judges. And you will have a change in judges with the status quo as well. But let's get to the point about education. The number one job of the Attorney General is to defend the existing Kansas laws on the books, and that includes funding laws, whatever they may be coming from the legislature. I won't make a preliminary decision like my opponent and decide whether I think that law is constitutional or not before I defend it. It's the AG's job to defend it. But number two, if the federal government exceeds its constitutional authority and tries to impose something upon Kansas schools, it is the Attorney General's job. Indeed, he's the only official who can stop it. And that's what's happening right now. The Biden administration said they're going to use federal school lunch fund subsidies to force schools across the country to stop discrimination in schools with regard to trans individuals using the bathroom of their choice and perhaps other areas. And several attorneys general have sued, and that is right to do so. Now, he has said in the prior debate, no, he doesn't want to sue. Well, the next step will be the Biden administration will use that same money as leverage to force schools to allow biological males to compete in girls' sports. I will sue to protect girls' sports. He said he won't do it.
I'm going to do another follow-up question here, and this is actually from one of our audience members who's given us this question. It's going to go first to you, Mr. Kobach. The AG office does not have infinite resources. Are filing these federal lawsuits a good use of the office?
Good question. So the AG office has about 160 personnel when it's fully staffed. Right now there is a shortage of 20 people. There are 20 vacancies, both attorneys and support staff, in the Attorney General's office. So there will be the hiring of new attorneys, and then the Attorney General has to decide where they go. The litigation unit will probably be a grand total of 3 people, me plus 2 of the nation's other experts in this area of confining the federal government to its constitutional limits. So it'll be relatively small, but absolutely we have to fill those positions, and it's getting increasingly harder to do so because the state is unable to pay its attorneys as much as the private sector can pay attorneys. But absolutely we have to recognize that Kansans' rights, the prices at the gas pump that you mentioned, Nick, a moment ago, they are affected more by the unconstitutional and illegal actions of the Biden administration in many cases than they are by what's happening right here in Kansas.
You got a chance to respond, Kris Mann.
Thanks. Well, I can tell you we're not going to sue our way to lower gas prices. Kris Kobach's not going to sue our way to a better Kansas. That's not how it works. It's the hard work of the Attorney General's office, day in and day out, public servants who are out there doing their best protecting the people of Kansas. That's what's going to move the needle. Now, I can tell you that I've been endorsed by groups like the Kansas Livestock Association, a group that typically only endorses Republicans. But I was endorsed because I talked to them. I listened to them. And we talked about litigation that's pending against the federal government for overreach that's hurting our farmers and ranchers from putting food on our tables. We talked about future litigation that'll be necessary. Those are the areas that my office will focus on, the areas that will directly impact the people of Kansas and help them the most. That's where we need to focus this office, not hiring a bunch of political cronies and waking up every morning for breakfast, coming up with a way to sue the federal government. That's not what the people of Kansas want.
This public television viewer wants to know, do you favor red flag laws to stop dangerous people from getting weapons, Kris Mann, and do you favor assault weapon bans?
Well, I can tell you that I've been a police officer. I support the Second Amendment. I'm a gun owner. But as a police officer, I also understand that we need to keep our communities safe, and we need to protect our rights. I think we can all agree that violent offenders should not have access to guns. I think that's something that we all want to make sure doesn't happen. We can also agree that there's a need for more gun safety. There was a gun that was taken to school just this week in a rural community in Kansas by a 12-year-old child that was taken from his parents' closet because it wasn't secured properly. We need to find ways to improve gun safety, which will keep guns out of the hands of violent criminals. In fact, my opponent could use some of those courses himself. He left guns unsecured in his car in Wichita. They were stolen and could be in the hands of violent criminals right now. That's just another example of why we need gun safety and to do our best to keep the hands out of violent criminals.
And you've got a chance to respond, Kris Kobach.
Well, I'm sure trying to figure out what his answer was, but I think he is for red flag laws because he says he wants to keep them out of the hands of guns out of the hands of dangerous people, and that's the whole premise behind them. You seize the guns from the person before he's at a trial and without even probable cause. That, ladies and gentlemen, and my opponent, violates the Fifth Amendment, right to due process, and it also violates the Second Amendment, right to keep and bear arms. So we have a clear difference here. I oppose red flag laws. He didn't answer the question with respect to the assault weapons ban. Of course, the so-called assault weapon is just simply the AR platform rifle, which is the most common rifle in America today. There are almost 19 million of them in widespread circulation, and contrary to the assertions made by some on the left, these are not used predominantly they're not used for mass murder. The Department of Justice tracks that as well, and 77% of such killings of 4 or more people are done with handguns. So again, there's been a lot of misinformation, but I believe that Americans have a right to protect themselves in the home and to protect themselves when walking across that dark parking lot at night. And one of the ways for home defense that is proven effective and is very common, and that's one of the things the Supreme Court looks at, is this a common method of home defense under the latest Supreme Court precedent? And one of those methods is the AR platform rifle. It is very effective for someone who is smaller stature or a woman to use in defending herself in that life-threatening situation. So I will answer the questions, and the people of Kansas will know where I stand.
Thank you very much. Kansas Attorney General Derek Schmidt, the Republican nominee for governor, says if he's elected, he will push the legislature to pass a ban on transgender athletes competing in women's and girls' sports in the first 100 days of taking office. If asked your legal opinion as the state's top lawyer, Kris Kobach, would you testify in support or against such a measure?
I would absolutely testify in support of the measure. And I'm curious to see if my opponent says, well, it's up to the legislature. I'm not going to tell you my position. The reason I will tell you my position is because I feel strongly about it, and the Attorney General should offer his opinion. Look, right now you have a situation where the federal government is pushing and outside groups are assisting in pressing for biological males to be able to compete in women's sports. Not only is it illegal if the federal government does it, it is a bad idea if the state government were to do it. The reason it's a bad idea is obvious. You don't have to be a Republican or a Democrat or male or female to see this. It's common sense. It doesn't make sense to allow biological males to compete in women's sports. I have 5 daughters, and I'm keenly familiar with and a fan of women's sports. One of my daughters, Reagan, is running very well in cross country, and she might make it to the state championships. But if she gets to that awards podium and the person who's in first place, taking it away from her, is a biological male, that's wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, this current trend of seeing trans athletes going into high school sports, going into college swimming, going into all kinds of running events, track events, weightlifting, is destroying women's sports. We've spent the past 50 years building a vibrant, competitive arena of women's sports, and now we're letting one very small movement pushed by a woke ideology destroy it. So absolutely, I would support limiting girls' sports to girls only, not biological males.
And what would you be doing, Kris Mann?
Thank you. Well, like my opponent just said, it's a very small movement by a very small amount of people. The federal government is not now pushing that issue. It's simply a solution looking for a problem. As I said in our last debate, our sports authorities and schools have handled this issue up and to this point, and they're the appropriate people to continue handling it because that's where it needs to land. I can also tell you that my opponent is only interested in divisive political issues. That's why he continues to bring them up and try and ask me questions about them. But what divisive political issues do is have real-world consequences. When I was at an event a month ago, a father came up to me and said that he had a transgender son that he lost to suicide, and he said it was in no small part due to the political rhetoric that is occurring in our country right now. Thankfully, in the Attorney General's office, we have a newly appointed Office of Teenage Suicide Prevention. My focus is always going to be on helping the people of Kansas. I want to make sure that that office is the best it can be and that we're keeping our children alive.
We talk about these kinds of issues that get lots of headlines, but what I love about some of these questions we're getting in is some rubber hits the road types of deals that often get overlooked in these kinds of debates and in these big campaigns for governor, Senate, Congress, and internally also with the Attorney General race. So I'm going to add 2 of these together. I'm going to ask your opinion on these and what your view is. First of all, one of the key roles of the AG is to hunt down and recover Medicare and Medicaid fraud. Why aren't we talking more about that role? And how will you assist rural Kansas police departments as Attorney General?
Well, those are 2 key priorities of my policy positions for office because Medicaid fraud is costing our state millions of taxpayer dollars every year. And every dollar that is lost to fraud is a dollar that somebody is desperately waiting for services. We need to do everything we can to make sure that we are building up that office instead of hiring attorneys to pursue Kobach's political agenda. We need to hire those attorneys to pursue fraudsters and hold them accountable. I'm the only person on this stage that has handled financial fraud. I'm the only person on this stage that has handled abuse, prosecutions, and I'll make sure that that is a top priority in my office, protecting the people of Kansas.
And what is your response to those 2 viewers with those very basic questions about the role of the Attorney General?
Well, unlike my opponent, I'll try to answer both questions. Firstly, the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General was moved to the Attorney General's office in 2017 to address the specific issue. And Medicaid fraud is a huge problem. Complaints from fraud skyrocketed during COVID. There were 227 complaints in 2019, but then in 2020, it jumped to 650 complaints, and last year it was nearly 1,200 complaints, allegations of fraud that had to be investigated. This is a big deal because whenever you have a large pot of government money sitting there, there will be an incentive for fraudsters to dig into that money, and there will also be potentially a situation with which the Office of the Attorney General's Inspector General has already found, where the government agency, KDHE, that administers it, is sending money out the door, millions of dollars of money out the door to people who weren't eligible, even to people who are deceased. More than $1 million went to deceased individuals last year, according to the recent report. But as to the second question, what about rural sheriffs? Well, let me point out that 32 of the 35 sheriffs who've endorsed me are from rural counties. Not a single sheriff who's currently sitting has endorsed my opponent. So the rural sheriffs know that I will support their communities. And one of the biggest ways the Attorney General's office can do this is through the KBI. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation can provide the resources that rural counties lack in investigating complex criminal matters, and I will provide that. And remember, this is important. The sheriffs themselves have made a choice here, and they have chosen me.
We're short in time, and we have some great questions, and they always come in at the last minute. Can I do these quickly? Is that okay with you, candidates? Because these are simple questions with some simple answers. First of all, with you, Kris Kobach, would you support putting Medicaid expansion as a public vote like the abortion issue was on August 2nd?
So the way the Kansas Constitution works, you can't actually put a statewide question to a vote unless it's a constitutional amendment. So our Constitution wouldn't allow putting it to a popular referendum unless the legislature put it in the Constitution. If you're asking me, do I support it? No, I don't support it.
Chris Mann.
Thank you. I have to address really quick. He talks about the sheriffs. I've been endorsed by bipartisan law enforcement, from chiefs of police to prosecutors to former U.S. attorneys, both appointed by Democrats and appointed by President Trump. Law enforcement across the state supports me because they understand that I'll do the job. He's been supported by elected Republican sheriffs. That's not a surprise. And part of my platform is working with rural communities. That's what I've done my entire campaign, is gone community by community, finding out how we can help and making sure that we'll provide the resources of the office to do just that. Now, as far as Medicaid expansion, it's been shown that that will help to reduce Medicaid fraud when the medical community has that money to use.
Congratulations, Chris Mann. You've just been named the next Kansas Attorney General. You just walk into your new office in Topeka, and the first big priority you tackle when you sit down at your desk is blank.
Is exactly what I have done for my entire campaign. It is listen to the people in the office, find out what we're doing well, and find out what we need to do better.
And Kris Kobach just walked into that office for the first time, and the first thing you do is blank.
First thing is start setting up the fentanyl interstate task force. We have a huge problem with so many fentanyl deaths, and that one has to be top of the list. Some of the other things I've mentioned will take more time, and I absolutely will do all of those things, defending Kansans against federal overreach, but the number one thing is setting up that fentanyl task force.
Thank you, everyone, by the way, for providing all these questions. Terrific range of questions. We've gone through a lot of different issues, but it's your final time to make your case to the voters. And that starts with you, Kris Kobach.
Thank you. My opponent thinks having political experience is a liability. He said that in this debate, the things that I've done in my career in Kansas. On the contrary, that experience is extremely valuable. He's never led a government office at any level. I have, leading the Secretary of State's office successfully for 8 years. He's never balanced a budget for any government agency. I have, and not only that, I reduced the budget of the office by 34% without cutting any services. And most importantly, he doesn't have a record, and worse, he's not answering questions clearly. We have no idea what his positions are on many issues, and we have no idea if he'll keep his promises. I do have a record, and one thing that Republicans and Democrats agree about on me is that I do exactly what I say I'm going to do. So when you hire an attorney, you hire the one that has the specific skills and experiences you need. What Kansas needs now is someone who can defend Kansas laws against the ACLU and can defend our constitutional rights against the Biden administration if it violates them. You do not hire an attorney like my opponent who has never argued a single case in federal court. You hire a veteran who has defended state laws across the country. When Arizona needed the best attorney to defend their human smuggling statute, they chose me. When Texas sheriffs needed the best attorney to sue the Biden administration to stop the violence in their counties caused by the immigration crisis, they chose me. And when the airmen at McConnell Air Force Base needed the best attorney to protect their religious freedom against the Biden administration's vaccine mandate, they chose me. And unlike my opponent, I will defend every Kansas law in court, whether I agree with it or not. I won't make a first decision as to whether I think it's constitutional and worth defending. He has said, and he essentially repeated, that he won't defend certain laws he dislikes or he decides that day are unconstitutional. And unlike my opponent, I will sue Joe Biden when he violates the Constitution. For example, if Joe Biden attempts to stop the drilling for oil in Kansas based on bogus reasons like prairie chicken populations, I will sue to stop him. My opponent, who contributed to Biden, will do nothing. If Biden attempts to take away our Second Amendment freedoms to keep and bear arms, I will sue to stop him. My opponent will do nothing. And if Joe Biden attempts to use federal money to compel Kansas schools to allow biological males to compete in girls' sports, I will sue to stop him. My opponent has just said he will do nothing. Kansas needs an attorney who has both the ability and the will to protect our freedoms against unconstitutional edicts from Washington, D.C. My opponent has neither the ability nor the will to do what it takes. I have both, and I would be honored to have your vote.
That's one vision for the future of the State Attorney General's office. Here's another from Chris Mann.
Thank you for having me here tonight. The contrast between me and my opponent is stark. I have spent my entire life devoted to making Kansas a safer place to raise our families. First, as a police officer, I put my life on the line to keep Kansans safe. There is no truer form of dedication than risking your life day in and day out for your community. Kris Kobach, while I was arresting criminals, he was running for office. When I was injured in the line of duty, I took the pain of losing that career that I loved and I turned it into purpose. I brought that same dedication to public service to prosecuting violent criminals in the courtroom. Again, keeping our community safe. Kris Kobach, he was again running for office. When I moved to the state, prosecuting white-collar criminals across the state in dozens of courtrooms, I held the hands of victims who lost their life savings to scam artists and then prosecuted those scam artists for crimes like fraud and money laundering. Kris Kobach, he served as lead attorney and board member for an organization indicted for those very same crimes. While I protected Kansans from fraud, he led an organization that was committing it. And you're right, while I was fighting for victims across Kansas, he was again running for political office. My entire life, I've done the hard work of keeping Kansans safe. This is Kris Kobach's 8th race for his 7th choice of office. This is my first choice for office after a career in public service. I am ready to bring the dedication of public service to the highest law enforcement office in this state. Public safety is my calling and my life's work. We are up against huge problems in Kansas. Violent crime must be addressed, and who better to address it than a police officer? White-collar crime must also be addressed, and who better to address that than a white-collar crime prosecutor? And finally, our constitutional rights must be protected. And Kobach's promise to slowly and quietly strip away those rights is a threat that he will not hesitate to follow through on. He said so himself here tonight. I'm the only qualified person on this stage who has spent his career protecting the people of Kansas and their rights. And I would be honored to continue to protect and serve Kansas families as the next Attorney General. Thank you.
Thank you so much. After this hour together, we know one thing is actually certain, and that's we know that the next Attorney General in Kansas will be a man named Kris. Now, the only question is, of course, which one? Will it be Republican Kris Kobach or Democrat Chris Mann? Only you will decide on Election Day. I'm Nick Haynes. From all of us here at the studios of KTWU Public Television in Topeka, and from our debate partners, the Washburn University Political Science Department, and for all of you amazing questions, thank you so much for providing those on Facebook and on Twitter. Good night.
evidence of Russian atrocities from Putin's invasion.
Russian soldiers killed my husband.
In collaboration with the Associated Press,
4, 5, 6 bodies.
Investigating evidence of Putin's war crimes.
We were starting to see videos showing a lot of civilian deaths.
And the pursuit of justice.
This project is not just about documenting the suffering. It's about understanding what you do with that suffering.
Tonight at 9 on KTWU.
Hi, Brandon Barnett with Blue Dot. For nearly 65 years, Blue Dot has been servicing Topeka and surrounding communities with their HVAC and plumbing needs.
Turn it on, turn it on, turn it on with Blue Dot.
Coming up on Your Voice, Your Vote 2022, KTWU is honored to feature candidates for Kansas State Treasurer. It's a live television event presented by the Washburn University Political Science Department. Get to know your candidates and be ready to cast your vote this November. Your Voice, Your Vote 2022.
Wednesday night at 7 on KTWU.
This is KTWU, local public television.
Black Americans, freedom, citizenship, and equal rights were signs that we had reached the promised land. But eventually, as broader opportunities opened up with the dismantling of legal segregation, some members of a community that had long been hemmed in by the color line started to question the meaning of life beyond the veil.
When we think about integration, we think about the gains that were made, but at what cost? At what cost to Black life? At what cost to Black institutions? At what cost to Black neighborhoods?
At the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, I brought together 3 generations of political activists and cultural leaders for a candid conversation about the state of Black institutions following the Civil Rights Movement. Bayard Rustin said to Martin Luther King, the group of people who are going to benefit most dramatically from integration is the Black middle class.
We got some degree of integration, and there were some benefits from that, obviously, but I think it also made us realize some of the things we had lost. In terms of community, in terms of support, in terms of knowing the history, we lost something there.
I would also say that integration and equity aren't the same. Until we address the systems, until we address racial bias,